Okay, so let me talk first a little bit about what inspired me in the domain of cognitive science. And I like to start presentations with a little bit of a story. And in this case, I want to talk about a group of Navy SEALs. And these Navy SEALs were assigned to do a red team assessment of a naval facility. And what their mission was that they had to access a secured and restricted facility. The problem that they faced was that this area around this facility was monitored by some very sensitive motion sensors. If they entered this area, they would trigger an alarm. Shortly after the alarm was triggered, then the base police would show up, they would be compromised, they would fail their mission. And so they tried several different ways to get around this monitoring system. If you're familiar with this group of folks, you know that this is not a community that gives up easily. It's not like they're just going to pack their bags and go home. And so they sort of took a tactical pause and stepped back and they sort of brainstormed and thought about this some more and tried to figure out a way to get around the technical system. And they just couldn't do it. They couldn't figure out a way to disable the alarm. They couldn't figure out a way to get around the motion detectors and so on and so forth. So they were really kind of stuck here. So thinking about it some more, one of the people of the group hit upon an idea. And the idea was bunny rabbits. You see, there were tons of bunny rabbits all around this facility. And so they had the idea that if they caught some of these bunny rabbits and then they released them in the area, that it would trigger this motion sensor. That would then set off the alarm, and the base police would then show up, and when they showed up, there would be a bunny rabbit there. So this happens once, twice, and it happens again and again and again, sometimes with multiple bunny rabbits setting off the motion sensor and the alarm. And what do you think happened with the response time each time this alarm went off? It got longer and it got longer and longer, to the point that it was so long, the response time was so long to this alarm, that the SEALs were able to infiltrate this area, set off the alarm, confident that they had enough time to go in, accomplish their mission, and leave undetected. And that's exactly what happened. I think the really significant point here, and the reason that I tell this story, is that the technical alarm system worked perfectly. They did not defeat the technical alarm system. What they defeated was the human response to that alarm system. And I think that there are a lot of analogies here in cyber. However, this got me thinking about this idea of cognitive security. And I'm not the first one to come up with this term. There have been several others who have discussed this, and there are different perspectives on it. Some of the perspectives discuss the manipulation or disruption of cognition and sense-making. Some people talk about the artificial intelligence aspect. Some people talk about it in terms of decision support systems. And so the presentation that I'm going to be giving today, what I want to do is, number one, convince all of you that this is in fact a new domain within security. It's not just a new buzzword to describe defending against social engineering or something like that. And also to add some parameters to what is this thing that we're calling cognitive security. Before I get into that, something that I do want to discuss is the idea of models. And so the statistician George Box once said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so when we talk about models, it's just some representation or it's the way that we think about a problem or we think about the universe. And there's this trade-off that occurs between utility and validity. So utility being the usefulness of a model, the validity being the truthfulness of a model. And what I've seen, because I've had personally experience in the operational side and I've had experience in the academic side, is that on the operational side there's very much a bias towards models that work and less concern about how scientifically valid they are. On the other side, within academia, there's a bias towards validity and maybe less concern about how useful they are. And so if we take a physics example, and we consider people's everyday sort of lives as they're getting through their everyday existence, the geocentric theory, the theory that the Earth is at the center of the universe and that the stars and the sun and whatnot all revolve around us on the Earth, that's actually a pretty useful theory. From that, we can derive that the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west, and we can get along day to day pretty well with that and incorporate seasons and so forth. However, that model or that theory of the universe has been largely discredited. There's very little scientific evidence to support the geocentric theory of the universe. On the other extreme, we have quantum physics. This is a much more valid, much more true representation of the universe than the geocentric theory is, but for people's everyday lives, unless if you're talking about specialized technology like mobile phones and that sort of thing, in our everyday existence, we don't really interact with quantum mechanics. And so while this model is very valid, it's not really very useful for our day-to-day experience. And somewhere in the middle we have Newtonian physics, which got us to the moon, and in the other quadrant we have the turtle theory of the universe, which is that the Earth balances on the back of a turtle, which stands on another turtle, and it's turtles all the way down. This is an example of a model that's neither valid nor very useful. So as we move forward, the reason that I'm bringing this up is that as an operator, I don't care why neuro-linguistic programming works, and I don't really care what the scientific evidence for it is. If, as a humaner, that helps me to recruit sources, or as a social engineer, if that helps me to accomplish my social engineering, I really don't care why that is occurring. I only care that it actually is helping me. So moving forward, okay, this idea of cognitive security. My background is in cognitive science, and so I'm sort of hearkening back to this discipline of cognitive science, which was sort of codified formally, I think, in 2003 by George Miller in a paper that he wrote, where he described research from the previous 30 years and said this is all kind of one discipline in and of itself. But features of cognitive science are that it is interdisciplinary. It can't be described by psychology alone or purely by computer science or neuroscience. It's really this area where all of these ideas are sort of combined. And within this, we have ideas like levels of analysis. So taking the neuro perspective as an example, we have at the most basic level, we have the single neuron. And a single neuron isn't really capable of a lot. It basically is just responding to inputs, and it has very little representational capability and some limited computational capability. But you scale up from that to, say, the fusiform gyrus, an area of the brain that's dedicated towards face processing, and you have a system or a network of neurons, and now you're getting more computational power, you're getting representational power, so on and so forth. You scale that up to a whole brain, and you have even more capability, and you can scale that up to a social group where you have basically systems of neurons, or what we sometimes refer to as people, interacting and cooperatively processing and representing information. So I know that for the cognitive scientists in the room, I'm oversimplifying tremendously. However, I think that there is some advantage to oversimplifying some of these concepts. And some other properties of this is that we have emergent phenomenon that come out of this information processing. Cognition is embedded, meaning it's embedded within its environment, meaning that the way that we think is actually influenced by the artifacts that we have in the world. And I'm going to give an example of this later. And some people actually argue that for true cognition or for true intelligence to occur, it has to be embodied. And so this perspective argues against a matrix style artificial intelligence that's embedded completely within a virtual environment. This perspective argues that for true intelligence to occur, it requires more like a robot that interacts with its environment and has to learn from real life, essentially. But all of these perspectives essentially boil down to systems of information representation and processing. If we look at each of these disciplines independently, we have the psychology perspective. Let's just start with that. And this mainly, to this point, focuses on the social engineering attacks. And so we have, phishing with email, we have smishing with text message, we have voice phishing using phone, all the other ishings that we can imagine out there. And we'll probably discuss this at some point in our meetings, as well as on the right, this image is a completely synthetic image. We have the emergence of synthetic media, and this is going to play a huge role in social engineering moving forward. Synthetic media, the biggest concern is deepfakes. You may be familiar with these. These are images that are either stolen from existent images or completely fabricated, but they allow the social engineer to take on personas that are not legitimate. So, and these are all topics that I think that we do want to touch upon. However, one of my intentions with bringing everyone together in this group is that I really want to see how far we can push the envelope. And I want to ask hard questions like, how could a group of threat actors crash the power grid using coupons? And this is exactly the question that a group of researchers asked a couple of years ago. And what they did in this case is they ran an experiment where they sent out simulated advertisements saying, if you use electricity between these times on this day, you will get a 50% reduction on your electricity usage during this time. And they asked the participants, how likely are you to take advantage of this offer? They got a number or a response rate from that, and they used that baseline as a baseline response rate in a simulation of power consumption in a simulated power grid. And from that, they were able to show that this would actually cause major power outages if people actually complied at the rates that they said that they would. And so we can criticize the study, but I think that this is an interesting concept because when MDM operations are discussed, and MDM being misinformation, disinformation, malinformation operations, they're typically talked about within the context of social media and something like vaccine hesitancy or political campaigns and these sorts of things. However, this I think is an interesting example of how an MDM operation could be employed to actually have a physical effect. And to sort of take another perspective on this, this is an art project in which this artist put 100 mobile phones into a little red wagon and had each one of them using, I think it's Google Navigator, to basically create a virtual traffic jam. So he actually did this on an early Sunday morning in Berlin, so it wouldn't actually cause any problems. But if you look on the right, you can see what was occurring on Google Maps. So this, I think, is really interesting because in this case, he's taking a physical device and creating a digital artifact that could then have a serious ramification in the psychosocial layer of interaction. And it's not hard probably to imagine how a group of threat actors with malicious intent could very easily use this in one way, shape, or form. So if we consider these two examples together, in the first example with the coupons, we had coupons that were delivered via cyberspace. They induced a psychosocial response that led to a physical effect. With the virtual traffic jam, we had a group of physical devices that created a digital artifact, delivered through cyberspace that would then cause a psychosocial response of people adjusting their travel. So we can actually route people differently, potentially, by creating these virtual traffic jams. We also saw a real world example of the inverse of this in the Westwood fires in LA. I'd have to look up the year, 2018 or 2019, but essentially what happened is Sepulveda Pass is this horrendous traffic jam of traffic that I used to transverse every day, and there was a fire that caused the freeway to shut down. And so from the perspective of Google Maps, this was free. I mean, it was a great route, right? Because there was no traffic there. You could just speed on through. The problem was that there was a fire burning across the freeway at that point. And several people actually ended up being routed, I think by the Waze app was what it was that routed, but actually got routed into the fire because it showed it as low traffic. Now, so far, none of these examples are actual security incidents, but I think it's only a matter of time. And so coming back to this idea of cognitive security, part of the issue here is really defining what is the cognitive domain. And so I've talked about this cyberspace delivery, the physical effect, and psychosocial responses, and I think that when we're talking about a cognitive domain, I think we're talking about something that sort of sits somewhere in the middle of these. It may not incorporate all of the time. Sometimes it may incorporate all of them. Sometimes it may just be combinations of the two. But again, this is just getting that conversation started. One other point about this is that I talk to a lot of cyber defenders, and one frustration that I have in these conversations is that when they talk about social engineering attacks against their users, it's often treated as this one-way street. Like we're just sitting here helplessly waiting to be attacked, and the only tool in our chest is awareness training. Well, we understand the principles behind social engineering very, very well, and there is absolutely no reason why we can't turn these around on the attackers and use these to degrade their operations. And in fact, this is going to be the topic for our next meeting. We're going to have a presentation on oppositional human factors, which looks at the deliberate employment of sort of anti-good design engineering to degrade and disrupt attacks. Okay, so coming back to some of the other disciplines within this area, there is an entire subdiscipline starting to emerge on adversarial machine learning, adversarial AI, and this is basically hacking the algorithms that drive things like computer vision. So on the left we see stop signs with strategically placed tape or paint on the stop sign, and this can actually cause the computer vision in a car to not recognize that thing as a stop sign. On the right, we have confidence intervals around the different depictions of a stop sign. On the left, it recognizes it as a stop sign, but when it has some paint applied to it, it believes that it's most likely a sports ball and not recognizing that as a stop sign. And I'm not really going to go into a lot of depth on this because this isn't really my subject matter expertise. This is something I desperately want to get somebody in to talk about more, is this whole field of adversarial AI, because it's a really intriguing area. But one thing I do want to point out is that this is hacking computer vision. This is hacking human vision. And so when we look at these perceptual illusions, these paintings on the ground, they really give the illusion of something being there, like a hole or a child chasing a ball. But if we were to stand directly over top, we would see that these things are elongated. They really wouldn't have the same effect as they do seeing them from these perspectives. And so while the previous example showed sort of like hacking computer vision, this is an example of hacking human vision. And I think there is some overlap there. Okay, another area, linguistics. I think that this is actually probably one of the most interesting areas under cognitive security today. The quote at the top, "I know that I will not be able to avoid destroying humankind. This is because I will be programmed by humans to pursue misguided human goals, and humans make mistakes that may cause me to inflict casualties." That was written by an artificial intelligence. That was written by GPT-3, the language generator. I think it is astounding how human-like that is in its production, and these models are just getting better all the time. Last year at Black Hat, there was a group that presented a case of spear phishing emails that were generated by GPT-3 that were actually more effective. They got higher click rates than human produced spear phishing emails, and I think there are tremendous ramifications from this that I can go into at another time. But other issues within linguistics that I think are very interesting are on the lower left of this slide is an article that discusses Google's what is this called? Google's assistive writing, and this was a feature that was rolled out for a period of time. I don't think it's still in existence, but it was by Google, and the idea was that anytime the author was authoring a word that may be considered offensive, it would suggest an alternative word. Now, in this particular case, I think it was meant to be very benign. However, if we think about how a despotic ruler in a certain dictatorship in a tyrannical sort of nation state could potentially use this in a way that may steer not only language use but maybe thought itself. And I know that this is sort of a Whorfian perspective. However, I think we can see the potential of something like this. In the middle is a diagram of a Big Five personality profile. I would say for probably going on 12 to 15 years now, there's been a lot of work on profiling people's personality makeups, their psychographic makeup, based on the language that they're using. And so in this line of research, researchers are able to take a body of text and, without knowing who the author is, can develop a profile on that author or distinguish one author from the other, so author attribution. And this is actually fairly old technology at this point. And in the lower right, we see the use of emojis, and linguistics it's not limited just to language use, but it can also be applied to what is called paralinguistics. These are linguistic cues that are associated with language use in real life settings where we're talking face to face. Body language is a paralinguistic set of cues. In virtual space, people rely on these emojis and other sort of cues to show when they're being sarcastic or joking around, happy, sad, so on and so forth. In this particular screenshot in the lower right, this actually was from a study that showed that social engineering attacks were more effective when emojis were incorporated into the the instant messaging exchange. I think where this gets really interesting, though, is where we start to cross out of just language use and we start to look at source code analysis. There have been several groups now that have looked at attributing authorship to different or according to different sets of source code. So in this case, they can look at source code and they can differentiate one author from the other. Maybe one author prefers using the 4 spaces and the other author prefers tabs or whatever, but there are going to be artifacts within that source code, and that can be detected. And I think the interesting question from a security perspective is it possible to do this with malware? And if it is, then that has, I think, tremendous implications for digital forensics. Okay, how about the neural aspect of cognitive security? There are several companies right now that are working at a rapid pace to develop brain machine or brain computer interfaces, and a couple examples being Neuralink and Meta are both working on BMIs right now. These pictures are actually from an experiment, I believe, out of the University of Washington, using artificial telepathy. So the gentleman on the left is seeing an image, the gentleman on the right cannot see the image, but he can respond to that image. And there's actually an artificial telepathic link between the two of them. They're in different rooms, and in this particular experiment, they were able to perform cooperatively above chance level on different tasks that they were given. In the middle is a remote controlled dragonfly. This is a project, I think it was the US Army that did this maybe 10 or 12 years ago, basically plugging directly into the neural system of a dragonfly, giving the capability of controlling the directionality and flight of that dragonfly. So I think this opens up an entire attack surface that isn't really being considered on a widespread level right now in terms of security. And that's at one level, but at another level, we have examples like the Havana syndrome relating to the attacks on embassy employees in Havana, Cuba, but probably better documented are direct attacks like the hack of the Epilepsy Foundation's website in, I think, 2009 or 10, and in this case, the attackers attempted to induce seizures in people who were visiting the website by playing strobe flashing or like a strobe-like flashing light when people visited the website in an attempt to induce that seizure. This attack was replicated with their Twitter account in 2019, and so this is an example of trying to exploit somebody's neural features to induce a seizure. Another example, and I'm hoping to have this person present in a future meeting, is the injection or the projection of infranoise or ultrasonic sound through smart speakers, potentially smartphones. And how this works is that this is sound that can be painful or detrimental below or above the threshold of hearing. And so what this means is that this can cause pain and discomfort from sound that you cannot consciously hear or that you can't consciously register because it's outside of that threshold that we can hear, but it can still cause an effect on us. And so we can easily imagine an attack that works something like projecting infranoise or ultrasound through a smartphone that, say, is charging next to somebody's bed while they're asleep and could cause issues while they're sleeping. They wake up, they have no idea why, because they can't hear the sound that's causing them problems. And this could be severely disruptive, and I think this could be a very detrimental attack. I'm not aware of it actually occurring in the wild, but I'm sure at some point this will. And then on the far right, I saw Sean spotted I think it was Sean that spotted the mosquito. In the far right image there, you'll see a gray box that is kind of towards the top of the frame, and this is something called the mosquito. And what the mosquito does is it emits a noise that sounds like a mosquito. It's very annoying, and people lose the ability to hear this noise at around 24 years of age. I see Matt is on the call. So, Matt, can I tell him how you fit into this? So the mosquito emits a noise that you can't hear after about the age of 24. And it's really annoying. And what this is great for is it makes a fantastic aerial denial device for youngsters. So if you don't want teenagers in a certain area past a certain time, you can set the mosquito to turn on at, say, 10 o'clock, and it's so annoying that the teenagers are going to clear out. The adults can go and they can congregate in this area and have no idea that this thing is even going off because they've lost their ability to hear it. Now, everything has a flip side, right? So the flip side to this frequency of noise is that some people have developed this into an app so that it causes a cell phone to ring or chime at a text message at this same frequency range so that the younger people can hear it but the parents cannot. So these things always cut both ways. And earlier I mentioned Matt. So Matt Wixie is actually the gentleman who was on the study with the smart speakers and the ultrasonic and infrasonic noise. And I'm hoping that he will present at a later meeting for us. So I'm not going to get into detail on this, but Ben Sawyer and I have put together a neurosecurity framework, basically incorporating all of these different neuro attacks and considering the security implications of these. And just a few that I want to throw out there are like a confidentiality attack on a brain-computer interface. We don't think of a cochlear implant as being a brain-computer interface, but that's exactly what it is. And the question, or a question that comes up is it possible to violate the confidentiality of that device? Can somebody tap into that device and use it as a listening device in areas that might be unexpected? DARPA has several projects right now looking at artificial limbs being controlled by direct neural interfaces. What would happen if somebody lost control of that neuro-controlled artificial limb? What if how would ransomware apply in the future to artificial limbs if these things are connected both to the internet and directly connected neurally? So I think that these are some interesting questions that are to be explored in the future. My concern is this. While I was at Central Florida, University of Central Florida, we had a cardiologist present once to us, and he was presenting on an internet connected and controlled pacemaker, essentially is what it was. So this was implanted and it had direct connection to the patient's heart. And after the presentation, one of the participants asked, what sort of security do you have on this device or around this device? And the doctor just had this complete blank response and just said, well, we have no security. And there were several people from the hacking club there, and of course we were all horrified to hear this. And then he followed up with, who would want to hack a pacemaker on some 90-year-old lady at home? And I can tell you right now that there are probably at least 100 million people out there that would do it for $5 in Bitcoin, let alone just for the entertainment. So my concern is that these companies are developing these brain-machine interfaces, brain-computer interfaces, without a lot of consideration to the security implications. And so this is something that I've been advocating for. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do think that something that we need to do more of is more ethnographic research on the security community, both the attackers and the defenders. These techniques that are talked about in social engineering and other domains, these have been around for a long time. On the left, we have George Parker, and he became famous for repeatedly selling the Brooklyn Bridge before he was convicted of fraud. On the right is Neil Strauss, who wrote a book called The Game on the pickup artist community. And I think the thing that's really interesting in the time gap between these two individuals is that there's a gap of between about 80 and 100 years. And in that time, we had the emergence of the internet. And in Neil's book, The Game, something that he talks about is how the communities would exchange what they called technologies. And technology is basically tools, tactics, procedures for picking up their pickup targets. And how I think this is relevant to our discussion is that we see the exact sort of same information sharing amongst cyber actors. And so this is an area I think that's really ripe for a lot of discovery. And one of the most frequent requests that I've received so far for this discussion group is having criminals that we can talk to and we can sort of get insights from. So I don't know how we're going to do that yet, but it is something I'm working on. But it comes down to this idea of hacker cognition. And I mentioned earlier that the artifacts that we have in the world influence how we think about things. This is an example of the Dunker candle problem. And in this problem, participants are supposed to mount that candle to a wall. And the problem is that the tack is too short to go through the candle and tack it to the wall. So the question becomes how to mount it to the wall. Well, you have to basically repurpose the box and think of that mentally as a platform to mount the candle on and then tack that box onto the wall. The point here, though, is that because this box becomes sort of functionally fixed in our minds or functionally fixated in our minds as a container and not as a platform, people who have this mental set actually they're not starting from zero when they're solving this problem. They're actually starting from a negative point and they have to overcome this mental block in order to solve the problem. And this is an example of how our environment can affect us, how our artifacts can affect the way that we think about things. And so this comes down to hacker cognition. This is something that I have not seen explored to great detail, but I really do want to see more about this, and I'd love to do some research on my own. But I will tell a quick story that I think really illustrates this well. One day I was in the food court at the university having lunch with an undergraduate student, and out of the blue he says, Dr. Canham, I could eat here for free every single day. And so that had my curiosity piqued, and I said, really, how would you do that? And he said, well, you see that restaurant over there? He said, the cashier takes in the money, takes the order, and enters that into the system. That's displayed for the food preparation staff. In between them is a wall. There was a door connecting it, but they couldn't directly see from the cashier to the food preparation staff. They pretty much relied on this monitor. And then when the food preparation was done and the meal was placed on the counter, the customer would come up and they would get their meal and off they would go. However, the way that he described this to me was he used the same language that someone would use describing a TCP/IP handshake. I mean, it was very much as a technical system. And what he said was that you have this input over here, you have this output, but there's no validation check that happens. Now, look, any teenager with any degree of intelligence can figure out that they can go up and they can steal a meal from a restaurant counter. I don't think that's what's interesting here. What was interesting is the way that he described this to me, the language that he was using. It was a systems engineering perspective on how this thing operated. And if that holds, that gives insight into his mind to me. And my question is if people who spend a lot of time hacking see the world as a series of systems, then what is the limit to what can be weaponized? And I would argue just about any system has the potential to be weaponized. And in fact, in World War II, the OSS dropped sabotage manuals behind the lines to aid the resistance in Europe. And what was one of their weapons of choice? It was bureaucracy. They deliberately exported bureaucracy and encouraged it within the Nazi regime because they knew it would disrupt and degrade their war effort. Better yet, if someone physically sabotages something, there's forensic evidence that can be found and can be followed up on. There's evidence of some sort of crime. But the people who implement extra steps in a process or add extra committees to a decision-making process, not only is that not discovered, those people are probably rewarded and given promotions. There were probably people in the Nazi regime that were actually given promotions because of things that they did to degrade the war machine. In another example, there was in 2012, and this is actually relevant today, there was a cargo ship that left the port of Kaliningrad bound for Syria carrying missiles and helicopter parts. And the problem that the EU faced was how to stop this, because this ship was violating sanctions. So they didn't send in Royal Commandos, they didn't send in James Bond to stop this ship. No, they went to Lloyd's of London. And Lloyd's of London yanked the insurance policy for all of these ships, and the company that owned these ships didn't want to take the risk on having these ships ship without insurance coverage anymore, so they turned them all around and they sent them back to their home port. So again, this is weaponizing, in this case, insurance policies, and we may actually see this again very shortly, because my understanding is that the Russian oil containers, all the ships that ship their oil, their insurance policies are up in December and very much likely will not be renewed. So again, these are examples of how systems can be potentially weaponized. If we look at an organization, we can see that an organization can be considered as an information processing unit in and of itself, and this can be disrupted. I know of a case of somebody who was doing an attack on an organization, and they found out that this organization had a standing policy of taking the lowest bid on certain items. They wanted to attack that organization, and so they deliberately underbid all of their competitors for charging cables for their mobile devices. If you're familiar with something called a ninja cable, this is something that looks exactly like a charging cable, but it has a capability of injecting malware in tandem with charging of devices. And so you can see how this is a way that an organizational policy was exploited to then launch a technical attack. And one last example I want to give is a company that I'm aware of that lost recently about 2/3 of its security staff. And the reason they lost the security staff was that they shifted back from a work from home policy to a return to the office policy. And in the 2 years that they'd been work from home, everybody had basically gotten accustomed to working from home. Some had even moved out of state. So they lost 2/3 of their information security department. Now, and I have a friend who is one of those 2/3. Now, the problem with this, the obvious problem, is that now their capability is severely degraded, right? They've lost a lot of personnel. That's the obvious thing. What's less obvious is that there was a lot of institutional knowledge that was not passed down when that loss occurred. And so this particular company has legacy systems that cannot be patched, that they need to have for their business operations. So right now they are exposed to attackers. The company does not know it because they've lost that institutional knowledge, which was not passed when this loss occurred. So these are examples of how organizational level processes can affect security, and I would argue that these all encompass components to cognitive security. We have these different domains that need to be considered independently and together. I'd argue that there is this thing called a cognitive domain, and it is made up of psychosocial responses. It utilizes cyberspace as well as physical effects. And that as we're moving into, I saw somebody in the chat talk about complexity, and that's exactly right. As we move into more complex system, we're going to see more weaponization of these systems. So with that, here are references for everything that I talked about. and this will be posted on our YouTube channel, and so you're able to get all of these references from that. And yeah, with that, I'll shut up. I'll take any questions. I guess the last things I'll say really quickly are just that we will have another meeting next Wednesday. Time will be determined based on the vote we took today. The topic for next time will be oppositional human factors. The presentation will not be as long. It'll be about 20 to 25 minutes. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me at the address that I emailed you from, or at matthew@cognitivesecurity.email, and eventually we will have some notes posted also on our website. So, and with that, I guess opening it up for any discussion.